So which of these demon-ridden monstrosities are best and worst then? Time for a tier list of Codex Chaos Knights. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Knights, and specifically we're going to be going through the Chaos Knight Codex, talking about which units I think are strongest and weakest at the moment, and why I've ranked them where I have. The Codex has been out for a good few weeks now, and it has been interesting to see which datasheets have been rising to the top and appearing in a lot of the most competitive lists. I've based the rankings on this tier list between that and my own opinions. I'm certainly always happy to hear alternate takes though down in the comments below. In any case, I've ranked the Chaos Knights into 4 different tiers, from weakest to strongest. We'll go through each datasheet in turn, including the Forge World ones, and talk about why I've ranked them where I have. So first up, in tier 4, units that I'd consider suboptimal for the Chaos Knights, I've chosen to rank the majority of the Forge World datasheets here, I'm afraid. Basically anything with the Acastus or Cerastus classes. To be honest, these guys were already struggling before the Codex even came out. Their datasheet stat lines just didn't really stack up all that well against the Codex options, and now since the Codex dropped, I'd argue that things might have perhaps got worse for them. A bunch of the Codex weapons did get some slightly improved profiles, things like the new profile for the thermal cannon, and these guys are locked out of taking a whole bunch of useful options out of the army. A ton of the demon favours are inaccessible to them, seeing as they don't have the abhorrent or tyrant keyword, and the same is true for a bunch of relics and things. Kind of sad if you do own these, to be honest. It's not that they're unusable, but their stat line just feels directly inferior to a lot of the other options. Out of the 2 classes, I'd say that the Acastus classes have it worse, maybe could even have been in a lower tier compared with the Cerastus ones. Their firepower is pretty much worse than their equivalent in War Dogs or Knight Tyrants, and they're not that tough for 750 plus points. What's more, their melee got worse by transitioning to the Codex and getting the new profile for Titanic Feet. The Cerastus Knights, on the other hand, I think are a little bit more interesting than the Acastus ones. Some of them do have pretty okay stat lines. Things like the Castigator I think really aren't too bad, with the 16-shot bolt cannon and the fairly general purpose Warblade. And as a class they are fairly fast, particularly as the Codex abhorrent ones move 10 inches now rather than 12. On balance though, I just don't think it's ever going to be worth passing up the option for taking favours and relics on the few big knights that you have. And I can't see many people wanting to take these competitively compared with things like Desecrators or Abominants. Certainly a shame, and a bit sad that Games Workshop's Forge World FAQ didn't do anything to address this. Moving on into tier 3, I'd say that these are a bit more usable but still overshadowed. First up we have the Knight Tyrant, who I'd argue is probably the biggest loser out of any of them out of the actual Codex datasheets. Even compared with the Loyalist, the Knight Castellan, it just doesn't really seem like it's got all that much support. At least they can access the favours, but they cost more in many cases. They're fairly slow, and they hit fairly weakly in close combat. Out of the 2 variants that you can field, I feel like the Castellan pattern is so much stronger than the Valiant. The short range on the weapons just really don't do that any favours on such a slow platform. So if I were to run one of these, I'd take the Volcano Lance and Plasma Decimator one. To be fair, if you just need long range fire support, then I don't think that one is too bad. At least it has the 2+ save now, which is kind of hard to shift. And I feel that if you're running, say, an Infernal House Commentis household, they do get a bit better. Taking D3 wounds isn't the worst thing when you've got so many to start with, and they can make pretty good use of all the different parts of it, whether it's transhuman, extra movement, or +1 to wound on that Ectoplasma Decimator. Still though, people generally don't seem to be running them that much in tournaments, certainly not being seen as one of the most competitive Chaos Knights. The other knights I've ranked in this category are the Forge World, Questor Megara, and Styrex. I would have actually ranked these a bit higher, but it seems that Games Workshop just really don't want to give them the abhorrent class keyword, despite being a Questoris class knight for the Imperials, so they can access the buffs that the Imperials have, but they can't for some reason access the buffs for Chaos. To be fair, these 2 are quite solid stats wise, they have some real advantages going from them, with some decent range damage and decent melee stats with that claw. They still have movement 12, they get ignores cover, and a very nice invul save in close combat, which does make them significantly tankier. For whatever reason though, Games Workshop has chosen not to give them abhorrent. They have FAQ'd the Forge World Imperial Armor Compendium, and then even updated it again just the morning of this when I'm recording it. Seeing as they've been passed up in 2 different passes, it does look like it's deliberate. It does look like these guys aren't going to be gaining certain relics or favours of the gods anytime soon. Really quite a shame, as I think otherwise they would have been quite interesting options, but again I think they're not going to outcompete the Codex Knights with these stacked buffs. Moving on to tier 2 now. All of these datasheets I'd consider decently strong, but probably just a bit less likely to get picked than the ones at the very top of the tree. First up we have the Knight Despoiler, an Abhorrent class knight, which as we've said is a good thing. You get most Codex options on it, and the datasheet is the really very flexible one. You can basically have any armament of your arm weapons and carapace weapons, including interesting options like say double Demon Breath thermal cannon if you want it. I think that some builds of this could certainly break through depending on which household you're playing, but a lot of them do seem to cost a little bit more than the other specialised Chaos Knights, and it seems that people typically seem to be preferring the Abhorrent, Desecrator and Rampager over the more flexible Despoiler. I don't think it's all that far behind though. The thermal cannon's nice, and having a mix of melee and a carapace weapon could be good. I think you're not really losing out all that much by bringing one of these along in place of one of the others. Next up we have the Wardog Huntsman, which is in an interesting place. In general, I'd argue that all the Codex Wardogs are very strong indeed, and these aren't really an exception. They're basically the Armoured Warglaive pattern of Wardog. They get the Demon Breath Spear and the Reaper Chain Talon. The only real issue with this one is that the Wardog Stalker can basically fill the exact same loadout and gets that Terror Shades keyword for free, which can actually be quite powerful to try and finish off injured enemy units clinging to objectives for one command point in the morale phase. That means that if you're just taking the Stubber or you want to upgrade to the Havoc Launcher, the Stalker is basically flatly superior to these, as they do cost exactly the same points. As best I can tell, the main advantages to using the Huntsman datasheet are if you want the Carapace Melter Gun as an option. I guess it's not too bad on a unit that's often going to want to get close anyway. Or I suppose theoretically, if you've already spammed lots of little Stalker squadrons and you want to field yet more, then the Wardog Huntsman could allow you to field something that's basically the same. Realistically, I think that these guys are basically the same strength as the others, it just depends on what war gear you want, but just weirdly seem to be very slightly inferior to the Wardog Stalker who can choose to take the exact same loadout. Finally in this tier we have the Wardog Moirax, the Forge-World Armature class with the Lightning Locks, Volkites or Grav Pulsers. And I think it's kind of in a similar situation to the Huntsman, being an absolutely fine choice for a fire support platform, but just kind of outcompeted by the other class, in this case the Wardog Brigand. These guys often saw a lot of play with twin Lightning Locks or twin Volkites to help clear out hordes, but it's hard not to look at the Brigand and just see a very similar knight that kind of does the same job better. If you compare to the Lightning Locks, the Moiraxes typically get 12 hits on average, whereas the Brigand's Chain Cannon would only get 8, but then you combine that with backing it up with the powerful anti-tank Demon Breath Spear and the heavy Stubber on top, and the Wardog Brigand just seems flatly superior to that kind of build. I think if you want to field them competitively, then perhaps the only real niche that they have is to use the Grav Bombards, which to be fair can be quite powerful against things like Terminators with Armour of Contempt. They're decently high AP and also damage 3 weapons when you fire them against high save targets. In general though, I think they're a quality fire support option. They could still chuck out decent amount of firepower, particularly when buffed with the Helm of Dogs, but realistically I think if you're looking for Chaos Wardog fire support, you're looking at either Brigands or maybe Executioners. Talking of which, let's move into the strongest Chaos Knights around, and we'll start out with the new Psyker Knight, the Abominant. I've already made a full video reviewing this guy, but he's seriously quite tough for 430 points. The cost isn't too bad for a super heavy of his size, and then that Winds of the Warp spell will net him a 5+ feel no pain each turn, so he's going to be extra tanky to chew through. Layer that with a defensive favour such as Blessing of the Dark Master so you can't re-roll hits against him, and you could maybe even think about a relic like the Veil of Medrengard, and you've got a knight that's usually going to soak up far more anti-tank firepower than just about anything else in the list. His melee damage is better against some things than others, but still he can be a serious threat if he's Iconoclast and has the Knight Diabolus upgrade. Both of those can have him hitting with a serious amount of quality attacks and hitting quite accurately, and he can double down with his other good psychic power, the one to make your melee far more powerful. As a very solid knight that you might likely want on the front line scrapping over objectives, he can be quite nice for stacking things that actually make use of the Harbingers of Dread debuffs too. Upgrades like that one that makes your opponent test on 3d6, and he could take the Terror Shades relic as well. Perhaps his main weakness is that his shooting is kind of merely okay. AP -1 on the Volkite weapon isn't that great a place to be with Armour of Contempt around. It could potentially be ignored by high save targets, though I guess you still always have the opportunity to roll big if you do happen to just luck out and roll a couple of 6s to wound and drown the foe in mortal wounds instead. Perhaps not the craziest damage dealing knight, but an absolute tank of a unit. Next up we've got the Knight Desecrator, perhaps the single most solid all-rounder type knight, and people often seem to be taking this over the Despoiler, and I can see why. It's first of all a very cheap knight at just 400 points base, and for that you get some pretty decent abilities on the datasheet. The laser destructor is a pretty decent anti-tank weapon with a very high damage, and it's a very tempting one to upgrade to that Diamonus relic, which gives you an extra shot at that big hitting profile. Weapon skill 2+ in melee means it'll hit harder than most despoilers that are multi-roll, a pretty significant damage buff there, and it also gets you a helpful reroll 1's aura for nearby war dogs, something that's rarely going to go amiss. The despoiler heroic intervention thing is sometimes going to be handy, but I feel like this is perhaps more useful in more situations. In general, it just means that if you want a cheap and effective knight that's pretty solid at range and melee, this guy is a very solid option. Next up, we have the Angry Knight Rampager, the one with the massive chainsword and warp strike claw, and again another very cheap knight at just 400 points base before demonic favours. The Rampager's a fairly simple soul, a horribly dangerous melee threat that wants to get up in your face, hopefully be one of the knights to be taking the bullets the most and drawing fire from the rest of the army, and hopefully anything that it touches in melee should get cut down in short order, even more so if you have other melee upgrades for it, like being Iconoclast or Knight Diabolus again. A lot of the favours of the gods upgrades are pretty nice: Blood Shield to ignore imballs for a turn and just smash through a unit of elites, Beguiling Majesty to make it extra tough in combat, or maybe one of the Chaos Undivided ones, which could give you access to that stratagem to get up when you die, as well as making you much tougher. Having a 12-inch move gives it more of a threat range, and means that you could be charging after a very long movement if you were, say, Infernal, and that does make it kind of hard to ignore. I'd say maybe the biggest weakness of the Rampager is that it is just basically locked to melee only. With 9th edition terrain, it does have a bit more of an opportunity just to be screened out by enemy chaff units. If it gets blocked by cheap models for a turn or two, or that's all it can charge, you might well not make your points back. Or your opponent could perhaps deal with other things in your army before turning attention to it when it actually needs to. Still though, a massive threat for the opponent to have to deal with. They seem to be pretty popular as a general purpose melee powerhouse. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the War Dogs. I've already mentioned the Huntsmen and Moirax, which I feel are a little bit inferior, but maybe not all that much. War Dogs in the Chaos Knight Codex are just generally quite powerful. They're fast moving, have decent damage, really quite decent support options like stratagems and buffs from the big knights, and I'd kind of see the different datasheets as more of a choice of which war gear you want on them more than anything else. They do seem powerful enough to carry an army. Some people have been running entire War Dog lists, or ones that are mostly war dogs with just 1 or 2 big knights to back them up. First up, the Carnivore, which I've also made a video review of in full. It's very fast, retaining the 14-inch move, the cheapest knights that Chaos have access to, so it's a good one for trading on objectives and things. Its melee really is brutal, and it could easily make its points cost back in a single turn against the right targets, and it does get on pretty well with similar favours of the gods to the Rampager. Things like Beguiling Majesty or Blood Shield are both popular choices. It's hard to go too far wrong with a unit that's both cheap and fast and relatively expendable, gets objectives secured, and is also enough of a melee threat that the opponent can't afford to ignore it. Next up, the Stalker, as I mentioned before, is the more flexible version of the War Dog Huntsman. You get to pair a ranged weapon and a melee weapon, either the spear if you need more anti-tank, or chain cannons if you want to add a bit of anti-horde. Certainly not a bad choice at all for holding up a battle line, particularly in Iconoclast where their melee is pretty scary. It seems a lot of Chaos Knight lists are fielding a squadron or 2 of these guys to be the main objective taking and unit killing force. If you wanted, they can also give you a bit of Ignore's line of sight threat with a bunch of Havoc launchers. Barrage weapons certainly have been nerfed a bit, but focusing fire could potentially overwhelm one key unit with saves, something that is kind of important for Chaos Knights that might often struggle to reach isolated units. Next up, the War Dog Brigand feels like the strongest all-round shooting option to me. I talked about an army list a couple of weeks back when someone seemed to get some good success by spamming almost nothing but these. The Demon Breath Spears for anti-tank plus some chain cannons for anti-infantry means that they'll be able to deal with most things. Combine that with being fast and obsec and you've got a recipe for success. If you just want raw damage, as I mentioned, they do seem superior to the Moirax at the moment. Finally, the War Dog Executioner is the Armiger Helverin pattern version. The autocannons are damage 3 and AP -2. They've got a very long range, so they're quite a nice choice for sitting on home field objectives, ideally plinking away a few shots if they can while remaining safe. There's quite a few 3-wound targets in the meta at the moment, and that works out pretty well for their autocannons. With the shooting war dogs, they can be quite a good choice for something like Mirror of Fates, the one that allows you to farm command points, as they'll often be staying safe sitting at the back. Generally with Chaos Knights, if you go for anywhere between 1 and 3 of the top big knights, and then fill up the rest with war dogs, then that seems to be a way not to go too far wrong. So anyway, look forward to hearing your thoughts on the tier list. Let me know if there's any choices that you'd rank higher or lower as per normal. I'm always keen to hear alternate takes or other things that might work better than I've anticipated. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be keeping the regular 40k videos coming. There should be at least a few more videos for the Chaos Knights on their way. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention one way in which you can help support, and that's my Element Games affiliate link down in the video description below. If you live in the UK, Element Games is a discount retailer. They typically give between 10 and 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, including all the Chaos Knights. If you were thinking about picking up some War Dogs or the Abominant or anything already, then they could give you a fairly decent saving on buying the models compared with GW if you are in the UK. If you click the link and buy anything, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics, but it doesn't cost you any more when you buy. Can just be a way to help out the channel on things that you were going to pick up anyway. For people over in the USA and Canada, I do also have a similar Amazon link down there as well. That one works in much the same way. Click the link, buy anything from Amazon whatsoever, 40k or not, and a small amount goes to help support the channel without costing you any more. A massive thank you to you guys who have been using those, it really does help out. In any case, a big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.